Yeah, we very much have big Petrostate Energy, even though a lot of people, I think even internationally, don't think of us that way because we've got trees and kangaroos and things like that. But it's not just the fact that Australia exports more fossil fuels than the UAE. There are a lot of similarities there.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and today we are diving into COP, the United Nations Climate Conference currently underway in Dubai.
What do we want? Phase out! When do we want it? Now!
At the end of the hottest year in recorded history, the 28th Annual Climate Summit,
COP28.
Delegates in Dubai spar over the future of fossil fuels.
This is our last chance to start bending the curve of emissions from oil, coal and gas.
Language that would target fossil fuels.
The latest draft of the agreement does not refer directly to a phase-out of fossil fuels.
OPEC nations are among those pushing hardest against.
Around 100 countries are in favour of the phase-out, but some major fossil fuel producers, including Saudi Arabia, China and India, are opposed.
If we do not have strong mitigation outcomes at this COP, this will be the COP where 1.5 would have died.
We will not reach 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees if we do not phase out fossil fuels.
There's not enough money in the world to pay for the loss and damage that we would face above 1.5.
Fossil era will not end because we don't have any oil or gas or coal left. It will only end if we decide to make conscious political decisions.
Hosted by a petrostate this year, with some questionable agendas at play, this COP has raised significant questions about the role of COPs in general and Australia's role as a fossil fuel exporter that's hoping to bid to host another COP in 2026. Joining us to dive into the details and help us see the big picture is Polly Hemming, Director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program. G'day, Polly.
G'day, Em.
So it feels like this has been a bit of a wild ride, this COP. It's drawing to a close. How would you describe how it's gone so far?
Garbage fire probably is the kindest term I can use. Yep. I think, like, straight out of the gate, it was revealed, leaked documents showed that the UAE, which is hosting the COP this year, was planning on using the summit to strike oil deals on the side. The fact that the president of the COP also happens to be the CEO of the national oil producer was an issue of contention.
But Polly, who else would you want to host a climate change conference except an oil executive?
Well, fossil fuels are part of the solution, apparently, and that was one of the lines that he ran. So it was always sort of viewed with quite a lot of scepticism, well-founded scepticism. And then, of course, it transpired that the president of the COP had also questioned the science of having to phase out fossil fuels before the COP. So the tone was kind of set right from the beginning. And it's been 2 weeks of the COP, right? And we're getting to crunch time now. You'd think that all the big stuff happens right at the start, but actually there's a whole lot of really lofty commitments and announcements and pledges made at the start of the COP. Now it's when the rubber hits the road. And the basis of this whole summit has been this thing called the global stocktake, which is kind of what it sounds like, a big stocktake of where we're at with climate pledges and climate action and what the gap is currently to meeting that 1.5 degrees of global warming, which is what the Paris Agreement sets out to achieve. So kind of all the stuff at the start is sort of fluff. It's the last 2 days of the conference really is where everything happens. And if we thought that the beginning of the summit was a garbage fire, whatever is worse than that is what's happening now.
Unless we rapidly repair and restore nature's unique economy, our own economy and survivability will be imperiled.
We need realistic approaches to
tackle emission, one that enable economic growth.
They've got a plan to expand production of both oil and gas by an enormous amount, starting the minute the gavel bangs to end this conference. And that's a direct conflict of interest.
So, Polly, it's drawing to a close. This is, as you've said, where the rubber hits the road. What are we expecting to come out of this last couple of days of COP?
The next couple of days, or the last couple of days, is where we have a final body of text that all countries agree on that says what has to happen to keep, well, basically humans alive. What has to happen to keep within the bounds of a livable planet? Yeah.
And the push, correct me if I'm wrong, has been that for once we would actually have language in the text of the agreement coming out of COP for a fossil fuel phase out. That's kind of been the aim. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And this COP has been really significant because the Paris Agreement doesn't actually talk about fossil fuels, even though they're the primary driver of the climate crisis. I know.
It doesn't mention them?
Doesn't mention them at all. It talks about emissions and having to keep emissions down or phase it.
But not where emissions come from.
No.
Well, you wouldn't want to be specific.
No, you wouldn't. And there are countries still arguing that we shouldn't be specific. So this, in some ways, this COP has been incredibly important because I think it's been so outrageous in terms of it being hosted by a petrostate and an oil baron. It's really laid bare the issue of fossil fuels. And so the call for a phase out of fossil fuels has been stronger than ever by civil society on the margins of the conference, but also small island developing states and countries who are within the negotiating parties to the Paris Agreement. And you're right, it's about a phase out or a phase down. Like the text has sort of varied. There's been 4 options that are variations of phase out, phase down, abated, unabated, and there's a lot of wiggle room in that language. And the second most recent draft of that sort of started to step back a little bit from a phase out of fossil fuels and big countries big fossil fuel producing countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia were really pushing back against this. And OPEC wrote to countries saying, don't you dare, guys, there is no place for a fossil fuel phase out in the world.
Nice oil price.
Yeah.
Shame if something happened to it.
Yeah. Sorry. And then we've seen the next iteration of that draft and fossil fuels have been abandoned altogether. I think they're mentioned once.
Right, so a significant kind of weakening of that language.
Yeah. But what's really interesting is, if we look at this through an Australian lens, because you've got these countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia and China to a degree, although China's kind of had an interesting role in these negotiations, they've been so forceful and adamant and not even using weasel words. It's just been they're like angry toddlers just saying, nah, not going to happen.
Yeah.
That countries like Australia and the United States, who, for all intents and purposes, we can say are generally bad faith actors in these proceedings, look really reasonable.
So things are so bad at this COP that the world's third largest exporter of fossil fuels, Australia, looks like we're doing a great job because the bar is effectively so low that you could walk into it.
Pretty much. That's been the outcomes.
Never has a COP climate conference mentioned fossil fuels in its final agreement.
There's a big expectation going into this climate summit that this would be the first time that the final text would actually explicitly call for a phase out, or at the very least, a phase down of fossil fuel use. But this draft text that just came out this morning doesn't even mention the words oil or gas, let alone a phase out or a phase down.
We must be both and deliver a phase out of the consumption and production of fossil fuels.
Yeah, those negotiators are head down trying to either weaken or strengthen the language in the final agreement.
So while, the issue of fossil fuels is starker than ever before, countries like Australia look really reasonable in what they're saying. And that's because we are really good at using far more sophisticated language when it comes to our resources. We're pros at this. We can, and Minister Bowen has demonstrated this by getting up on a couple of occasions now. So Sultan Al Jaber, what he basically did is when it looked like we were really struggling to get agreement on any of this stuff, he basically convened a sit-down roundtable with all the countries. And it's like a real talk, guys. Come on, like put down your notes. Let's just riff. Let's just chat and be honest. And Chris Bowen, the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, got up and said, there's no role for fossil fuels in our energy systems, and I'm saying this is one of the world's largest fossil fuel exporters. He said all the right things, and of course that was met with praise back here from some people, and then went even further when fossil fuels were dropped from the text altogether, and gave another really quite emotional address that said, we won't be signing a death certificate of small island states, which is how it's been framed by the Marshall Island and Samoa and other countries.
Well, yeah.
Which is totally fair enough.
Is,
yeah.
If we fail to phase out on the use of fossil fuels, which contributes about 80% of greenhouse gas emissions, then we don't stand a chance.
So Chris Bowen has basically now has cover to say all the right things and look really reasonable. And if you weren't here in Australia and hadn't seen the last 30 years of how Australian governments, were on either side, how they've behaved and how they've kind of ferociously protected their resources industry, you'd probably think Australia was on the right side of history here. That, of course, ignores the fact that we've just seen documents that show that the Santos sea dumping bill was passed by Labor seemingly as a favour to Santos, the coal mines we've approved. So
4 new ones since May last year.
4 new ones, yep. And, in $1.5 billion for the Middle Arm gas export hub.
We must look to our future and to our fates and redouble our efforts to bring down our emissions and get our world back on track.
So Chris Bowen is saying all the right things. He's saying the things that we would want to hear. But if we look at actual actions, Australia's still expanding fossil fuels.
Yeah, exactly. There is no reason, again, the minister, and they are the right things to say, and the minister has been applauded in some circles for saying this, but to be clear, there is nothing stopping the Australian government from coming back here and saying, right, we don't want to sign a death certificate for small island states, so we're going to stop approving gas and coal projects. We're going to stop subsidising. We need to put an end to this. We are going to work with, rather than telling Japan that we're going to be selling our gas to Japanese companies in perpetuity, which is basically where we're at now, we are going to work with Japan to decarbonise both our systems. There is nothing that would stop the Australian government from doing that now.
OPEC and the oil companies right now are trying to whitewash the crisis that has been created by fossil fuels.
So that brings me, I guess, to greenwash, and we know that's always played a role in these climate summits, but we do see perpetually this idea of kind of big techno solutions, whether that's carbon capture and storage or hydrogen or, I don't know, any number of other things that always seem to be 10 years away. We're seeing increasingly, I guess, that playing a role to cover the expansion of fossil fuels. How big of an issue has that been at this COP?
It's a big one because that is at the heart of the abated versus unabated fossil fuels. So if fossil fuels are abated, then you've done something to capture the emissions, and so they have no impact on the climate, supposedly. Interestingly, Australia made a commitment before, it was crunch time with these final negotiations. It pledged that it would stop financing unabated fossil fuel projects overseas. And the key there is abated because, Australia actually, compared to our domestic fossil fuel subsidies, doesn't provide a huge amount of money for international fossil fuel projects, but
no, we're giving it all to the ones we have here.
Charity starts at home, Eb. So we do give, but it's the abated that's key there. So a project in Papua New Guinea, which is the Australian government has previously financed, could potentially still be eligible for Australian money if there is the promise of CCS being attached to it. So Australia is still leaning heavily on that abated idea.
And we saw just before Chris Bowen went to COP, he made a big announcement about investment into renewables, which is, to be clear, really important, really critical. We absolutely have to do it. And, you know, it's great to see the government playing a role in kind of kickstarting that investment in clean energy instead of just giving it all to fossil fuel companies. I mean, that does make a nice change. But the problem is, it doesn't matter if we keep expanding our fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, exactly. And that announcement is really significant and it is really important because renewable investment has been lagging in Australia and we are getting further and further away from meeting that 82% renewables in the grid commitment that the Labor government made. You're right. We talk about being a renewable energy superpower. Like this is just to meet our domestic commitments. If we want to be exporting hydrogen or clean energy, then we are going to need a lot more than 82% in the grid to be able to do that. But there is no suggestion that this energy will be instead of fossil fuels. It's very much in addition to. And
so we'll keep exporting all our fossil fuels, but domestically we're going to have much more renewable energy. So tickety-boo.
Yeah, well, that again is the idea. And this is what fossil fuel companies do as well. They say our net zero target covers our business operations, essentially, or the production of our gas and coal doesn't cover, once we've exported or you've bought our gas and coal, it's your problem. But we put out analysis today and off the charts that showed that actually 15% of Australia's domestic emissions come from digging up and producing fossil fuels for export.
Is that right? Just for export is 15% of our domestic emissions?
Yes, just for our exports, yeah.
That's incredible. That's huge.
It's nuts, isn't it? Yeah. So again, when Minister Bowen says at COP, as he did this week, we need to clean up our energy systems, our exports still have a role in that. We can't carve them off neatly the way that the government always suggests we can. Just because they're not in our accounts. Of course, the climate change that our fossil fuels cause is very much felt in Australia, but they also make up a significant amount of our domestic emissions.
400 delegates at COP28 are connected to fossil fuel industries.
This is 7 times larger than Indigenous peoples' delegation and a 4 times increase from last year's.
The contribution of the oil and gas industry is growing. It's tripling.
We need realistic approaches to tackle emission, one that enable economic growth.
We need a strong commitment to phase out all fossil fuels, not just coal, not just unabated fossil fuels, but all fossil fuels, including oil, gas, and coal.
Polly, Australia is hoping to host a COP in future in 2026. We don't like to think of ourselves this way, but essentially we're a petrostate. We export more fossil fuels than the UAE. How has this kind of disastrous COP shone a bit of light on Australia's bid to host a COP?
Yeah, we very much have big petrostate energy, even though a lot of people, I think even internationally, don't think of us that way because we've got trees and kangaroos and things like that. But it's not just the fact that Australia exports more fossil fuels than the UAE. There are a lot of similarities there. The UAE was talking up renewable energy offsets, the technology like carbon capture and storage. Australia, we've always been a skilled practitioner in human rights violations, but that's getting worse, especially in terms of free speech and whistleblowing and anti-protest laws. I think if Australia ends up hosting the COP, there are so many similarities that have been laid bare as a result of COP28 that if it goes the same way in 2026, and we've got a couple of COPs hosted by petrostates in between now and then, so could get worse. But if it turns out that Australia hosts COP31 in bad faith, we can't say that we didn't know that this was a possibility. You know, we have to come into this with our eyes open now. There is a lot of positive rhetoric about Australia hosting the COP, and I really hope that all comes to fruition. You know, I'd love to see Australia being awarded the COP as the thing that really moves the dial on Australia's commitment to fossil fuels, or ending fossil fuels, I should say. But if it doesn't, we can't say we weren't warned.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, I guess this has really brought home to us that fossil fuels aren't ever part of the solution.
There is no room at the table for fossil fuel companies.
Well, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much, Polly.
Thanks, Eb.
This episode was recorded on the 12th of December 2023, and things may have changed since recording, including what the hell is happening at the COP. If you found today's discussion enlightening, please rate and review us. It helps other people to find the show. And for more deep dives into environmental, economic and climate matters, head on over to our website at australiainstitute.org.au. You can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS, and I'm at Ebony_Bennett. Polly Hemming is at Polly J Hemming. And remember, for a closer look at the economic landscape, subscribe to our new weekly podcast, Dollars and Cents, with Greg Jericho, Chief Economist at the Australia Institute and columnist for Grogonomics at Guardian Australia. Thanks for joining us.